Hello and welcome back to the video introductions for the book, The Immersive World's Handbook. We're talking here about Chapter 7, which focuses on material culture, technology, and interactivity. Some of the topics we'll cover is the issue of material culture and how it plays a fundamental role in the development of any effective, immersive, and themed space. Talk about technology and how it helps develop the sense of immersion in the space. Consider the idea of movement and flow and how it relates to a great design space. And discuss finally interactivity and how the interactivity that you develop in a space between the space and the guest can be a key aspect of creating an effective space. Begin off with the idea of material culture. And in this section of the chapter, I talk about really how material culture, like some of the other elements in this book that we've talked about, allows you to really extend the story. You can use examples of paint, and many of these are covered in the book, lighting, water, art, all these sorts of design features, the use of images and objects. And basically, the concept here is to see these forms of material culture as akin to what a novelist or a poet would use in terms of the characters, the setting, the plot, the mood, and so forth that develops that vivid set of associations in the mind of the reader. So as a designer, the idea is you're using material culture to extend the story. I talk about different approaches that you can consider when you think about an object. And in this section, I talk about something as simple as the chair, which I think appears in just about every design space. And there are really four levels of the chair I discuss. One is a functional level, the chair, if you will, as a pure seat in which a guest sits. The second would be an aesthetic level, so it's functional in that the guest is seated in it, but it also has some design element to it. It might be a chair that has a particular modern design, and thus it has an aesthetic appeal to the guest. The third would be thematic. The idea is that it actually fits in with the space. So if you're developing a tropical space, you certainly wouldn't want a Western themed chair in that space. You'd want something that would fit in with the actual theme or the thematic approach to that object. And the last is a narrative approach to an object. And this would be an example if you went to a museum and you saw a chair in which a dignitary, a member of royalty sat. That chair would have the sense of a narrative behind it, a sense of history behind it. I then ask you a couple provocations or applications on what's the meaning behind a particular object that you could think of and how that would get used in your design space. I then talk about the idea of mana, which is a concept that's, I think, quite powerful from many Polynesian cultures. And it suggests that there's something special that's wrapped up in an object, a space, or a person, and it has a quality to it. So I use the idea of mana as a metaphor or an example for you, the designer, to think about creating a space that will have that same sense of magic. If you go to a Disney theme park, if you're a kid and you go to It's a Small World, or I remember as a kid, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, those were spaces that had mana to them because there was something about them that seemed absolutely authentic, real, believable, and there was something that always stuck with me in those spaces. So mana, I think, is a really inspirational idea that you can use in all of your design spaces. I then go over 10 different examples of what could be called story breakers, or what would be some situations where you're walking in a theme space and all of a sudden the story just breaks down for whatever reason. It's like in a novel. If you're reading a novel and something incredibly contrived happens, at that moment, as a reader, you might say, put the novel down. I don't even want to read the rest of the story. The same thing can happen in a design space. And I talk about 10 examples ranging from an unclear story to something sticking out like a sore thumb. It doesn't fit in with the theme or the story of the space. The gratuitous function is interesting. It's the feeling I've sometimes had where you'd be on a ride, incredible roller coaster. You get off the ride, you go through the queue house, and all of a sudden you're in a gift shop. And the gift shop doesn't do much to extend the story. In fact, it really is saying to the guests, buy a bunch of products. And I think the most effective spaces would somehow use that merchandising, which I understand is a key to that space, but it would use it in such a way that it's integral to the storytelling, to the thematic narratives that are being developed in that space. Also the idea of the bad actor. If you go to a space that has actors in costume and one person isn't doing their part or isn't convincing, that can really cause a breakdown in that space. So there are a number of examples of this, and I'll also throw it back to you as a designer and say, okay, as a provocation, can you think of any of these 10? Have they happened in your space? How would you correct the problem, and so forth? And then go into the important issue of technology. And technology is one of these issues that has truly impacted themed and design spaces of the last 20 or so years. If you go into a space nowadays, whether it's a museum or theme park or a cruise ship or restaurant, you probably are encountering technology in either a functional sense, something that is maybe behind the scenes, part of the operation of that space, or something that's really a part of the direct story. A video screen, some sort of immersive environment, the use of all kind of atmospheric technological effects to basically draw that viewer into the space and to keep him or her there for as long as possible. So I talk about the idea of technology as a storytelling device, and I'm really pleased for the 2 interviews in this section. I was able to get Bob Rogers and Carmel Lewis, who are both creative individuals at BRC Imagination Arts. They've talked about the many projects that BRC has done, ranging from the NASA Space Shuttle experience to the Abraham Lincoln Museum, also to some of the work that they've done in some of the world expos of the last 10 or so years. And they talk about really 2 things which I think are key to this chapter. It's not that technology is, on its own, but technology is something that is totally in connection with the story. It's as if the 2 are organically connected, and you shouldn't walk into a space and have gratuitous technologies just there for the sake of technology. We've all seen this probably in museums or theme parks, and we probably raised our eyebrows a bit. So what Bob and Carmel talk about is the ideal situation, which BRC has done very effectively, in which technology and storytelling are one. They're an organic product within the theme space. So I think you'll find that to be a really exciting set of interviews. Next I go on to the topic of mobile media, and I talk about how mobile media, the cell phone, the handheld device, has impacted the design of space and how you could consider it as part of the storytelling, and I think you'll see that to be relevant with one of the future interviews. I then go into one of my favorite topics, the machine and the ride. I present you with some opportunities to think about how rides themselves can tell a story. If you read Robert Cartmel, his wonderful book, The American Screen Machine, the overview of the history of the roller coaster, I think you'll find that aficionados of roller coasters and theme park rides come to appreciate the ride itself almost as if it's a living thing. It's a creature living on its own, and thus when you think about designing rides or including rides or other experiences in your space, you have to think about that as well as an extension of the story that's being told. I then address ideas of movement and flow, concepts of the master site. How do you lay out your site? I'll give you some exercises here. We actually will draw out maps and layouts and talk about how one layout or one map versus another might be beneficial to the development of your effective stories or themes that you're telling in your space. And then talk about issues of queuing and flows, how you develop a space such that you can manage guests and at the same time effectively tell your story. And I'll use an example of a group tour that I took to the Museum of Tolerance years ago and talk about my own experiences moving through the space and observing students and docents in that space and how they attempted to move people along and still get them to experience everything in this very harrowing museum, the Museum of Tolerance. I then talk about interactivity. And I think this is a key topic here because we're developing notions of technology in this chapter and talking about using technology in effective ways for developing stories, but it's key that you bring the guest in. If you tell a story and it's just a movie projected on a screen, that might be a compelling story, but maybe you haven't done enough as a designer to really draw that guest in and say, wait a second, there's more to the story and you're a part of that story. And so we'll talk about interactivity, and I'll discuss what are 4 worlds of interactivity. We'll focus also on the issue of games or opportunities for guests to be involved in a challenge within your theme space. Then we're fortunate to have an interview on compelling interactivity with Mindy Lipschultz, who is a cross-platform media designer and creative director. And she worked closely with BRC on one of the projects for the pavilions at the World Expo in Shanghai of late, and she'll talk about developing a particular technology there using a handheld device to help the guests interact with that space. She'll also discuss some of her experiences working in additional museums in California and trying to really create an experience that guests will come to love and enjoy. I end up on the topic of mystery and transformation. Sort of suggests we've been talking about technology and interactivity and forms of material culture. It really goes back to the experience of the guest. All in all, it goes back to the idea of mystery and discovery and transformation. It's my belief that whether you're creating a museum experience, a cruise ship space, a themed restaurant, or a theme park, the ultimate end result should be the same. The guest should be excited, and the guests, having left that space, should feel a sense of transformation. I think it's a real important opportunity for designers to use spaces not just to sell products, but really to get at the core of the individual, of the guest who comes to visit, experience, learn from, and ultimately be transformed by that space. Thanks, and I'll talk to you in the next video introduction.